and at that point had learned what many already knew, or many would know the next morning. Pennsylvania, the blue wall had begun to fall. So I stayed up and watched that, and went back to sleep. Woke up in the morning and carried on with the day, because yesterday we had a global summit event.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we had work ahead of us. But plenty of conversations throughout the day with folks that I know, some offering insights, some asking questions, plenty of reading. Look, there's a ton of Monday morning quarterbacking, and votes are still being counted. So,
Right.
in some ways that matters. Look at the races that are still yet to be determined, but in other ways, like the presidential race, we know the outcome. There is, we must move forward. Kamala Harris has conceded. We know that Donald Trump is now the 47th president of the United States. So a lot still to be discussed. Of course, now we're in the interregnum. We're looking at the planning. Trump is going to be assembling his plans. Broadening the transition team, getting ready for January. Let's see what happens.
Let's roll back to, let's say, last July of 2023. Or I don't know when President Biden announced his reelection, but let's say it was around last summer there, or early fall. No one was saying, "Hey, I'm not sure this is a good idea. Maybe we should have a full primary process." Yada yada yada.
Sure, and that's simply because it's not common to do that, and I think obviously. It's different in the circumstances with President Biden, first and foremost, given his age, and that was largely the conversation leading up to July, what was it, July 20th, July 21st
Right.
of this year, when suddenly there's the older candidate in the race is suddenly Donald Trump, because, President Biden has dropped out. So there's a lot of attention being paid to the fact that you have two men late into their 70s, into their 80s, that are looking at running for the highest office in the land, if not the world. And that's sort of the concern, right? Is, one, just, their capacity. Can they actually govern for 4 years?
Right.
And then also looking at the stamina that it takes to do that job. And then thinking about, on the one hand, they face different pathways forward. On Trump's side, he's only a candidate, right? He just has to work the campaign trail. President Biden is both president and candidate. That's two full-time jobs that you're trying to pull off at that age. So I think people
That morning briefing comes whether you like it or not.
No, exactly, and I think that's why people weren't concerned of oh gosh, should we have an open should we throw open the primaries, will President Biden be primaried, should we throw open the convention, what should we do about this? And then, of course, fast forward a year into July 2024, and he makes the announcement he's not going to seek re-election. Last time that we saw that is President Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, says, "I'm not seeking the re-election."
Who did it in March, mind you.
Absolutely, which paved the way forward to throw open the convention and allow the party to decide that. Now, there's a lot to be said about the complications that came out of doing that and the wreckage that it did to the Democratic Party. So, look, I'm not a party insider. I don't have inside knowledge
Right.
of this, but as somebody who is an appreciator of history, I can't help but look back and say that's our only example. It did not go well for the party. Maybe that's not the best pathway forward.
Maybe the coronation would be the preferred way.
Right.
Get everybody to consolidate.
Yeah, unify behind a candidate and then advance that campaign forward. Now, whether we're debating you've got 100 days, you've got 130 days, you have 200 days, I'm not sure that makes a difference. But, they did what they did, and everyone unified behind a candidate, a well-qualified candidate, a vice president, somebody who served as a senator, someone who served as an attorney general, and knows Washington, both from the executive branch, legislative branch. So it's not as if somehow she was just anointed by happenstance. I mean, this is a really qualified individual.
And she was the heir apparent, right? She was sitting in the number 2 seat.
And because if you game that out and say suddenly there is some sort of event or circumstance that would prevent the president from carrying out presidential duties, the vice president is the one heartbeat away from that seat, So, any time that the president goes to any hospital and is getting a checkup and might be put under anesthesia, the vice president's now in charge, right? You know, like that's why you have a vice president. So it's not as if, you know, a campaign wants to pick somebody that they don't have trust, who hasn't been vetted, that wouldn't be able to carry out the duties of that office. So
do you remember some of the, you know, some of the reporting back then when you know, Biden announces and they're like, we're not going to have this Aaron Sorkin West Wing type of fantasy where we'll just have a 2-week primary season and then pick at the convention. That was never going to happen.
No, and I think that, look, as much as like we can joke about it, you know, from the headlines of Dems in disarray, this was the opposite, right? You know, this was Dems in array. You know, they suddenly got all behind a candidate. You know, not all. I'm painting with a broad brush because there were those that had criticisms about Vice President Harris. But, you know, for the most part, there was a pretty quick unification around a candidate. There was a sudden injection of energy into the race that hadn't existed before. And mind you, of course, you know, whether it was the death knell or something else, we have to admit that President Biden had a monumentally bad debate.
Yeah.
He did not look well. And of course, they came out afterwards saying, he wasn't feeling well, you know, this, that, and the other. I tend to think, you know, maybe they over-prepared him. You know, he hunkered down at Camp David for a week. Advisors are coming in and out. They're peppering him with so much information. Whatever the case was, he did not do well in the debate. Yeah. And so that, I think, really began to get the national attention of, you know, can he win? Should he run? And whether it is back channeling, somebody talks him into it. He comes.
George Clooney writes an article, op-ed in the New York Times, and then Nancy Pelosi comes with her Baltimore strong arm tactics, right? I mean,
iron fist and a white glove. So you know, I mean, who knows how he got there, but he got there, right? Yeah. And said, you know, I'm going to put country over party. And I have no aspirations to run for president, but I have to imagine that if you've run for president, you are president, and you are being recognized as the most powerful person in the world, that's pretty tough to give it up, right? I think you could make that argument if that's why Donald Trump sought the office again. You know, there's something to be said about holding that office and being that person. So I really think for Joe Biden to decide not to do it, I think his intentions are genuine. I think he understands, you know, what was at stake. Could he do it? Should he do it? And ultimately decided not to. And he decided in July. And of course, we can what if it to death of, you know, what if he did that in the midterms? Well, maybe that gives a longer runway for a candidate, and maybe that's more successful. Maybe you do open the primaries, but you also are signaling to the rest of government that you've got a lame duck sitting around for 2 years. So how much can you actually get accomplished? Because, you know, I know now we're looking at how will history judge Joe Biden. I think that if you're looking at a Harris victory, people are going to herald him as one of the greatest presidents of all time because he did put country over party, stepped out of the way, did the right thing, and passed a lot of legislation, got a lot done. You know, whether it's the CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, all of that they were able to accomplish is not insignificant. That's really important work. And so they're able to continue to govern and work. So, you know, again, you can what if it, you know, 1,000 times to death. And I don't know that you get to a different answer, a different outcome.
So Kamala Harris, you know, again, is pretty much anointed, has a decent, strong convention, and then is overwhelmed with cash. I mean, she raised $1 billion herself, and they say it was like over $100 billion. This with all the PAC money and everything. There's just insane amounts of money, right?
On both sides, right? You know, so
not $100 billion, but you know, hundreds of millions. Yeah,
easily. And this, you know, and I haven't, you know, I haven't done the numbers of it just for inflation, but yeah, I mean, you know, from you know, broadly put statements, this is the most financed presidential election ever, you know, so a lot of money from both candidates pouring in, including if you take a look at, you know, the final phases of the Trump campaign, when you've got folks like Elon Musk jumping in and not only backing the campaign, but then giving away money to people to make sure that they're registered voters, you know, so you have the influence of billionaires in the election. You also have what I think to be a rather successful grassroots style campaign from the Harris campaign on the idea of the launch of, and then all of the derivatives of, Black Women for Harris, and and then the white guys for Harris, all the way down for that, of using that as a fundraising opportunity. So there is a lot of excitement around that. There's a lot of money being poured in because, and I don't think people were wrong, they're saying, this is the, most important election of our lifetime, which I think this is probably the third or fourth I've lived through, but they all seem to keep getting more important.
Right.
I don't think that they're wrong about that. And I think that's the idea of, how can I contribute? How can I do something for the average voter who may not have the capacity to canvass, might not have the capacity to get involved in a political campaign? Sending $25 or $500, whatever your means are, contributing something, and I think that that's not to be underappreciated or valued on the side for Trump, because here you have somebody telling you, campaigning largely on how bad the economy is, yet people continue to send him money, and so he's able to thread that needle of the economy's bad, you have no money, and eggs are very expensive, but send me money, and people would. So, it is interesting to see whether or not this will be an outlier or this is just the new norm, that you're going to see a lot of money flow into campaigns. And, we'll find out in 2 years in the midterms and see if there's still that kind of investment. But, for right now, what we know is a lot of money poured into both of these camps.
I want to take a break and 90 seconds, and when we come back, we need to look at these constituent groups, these people groups, because I think the big shocker coming out of Tuesday is all the different constituencies that moved at least toward Trump and toward the Republicans, not necessarily being taken over by the Republicans. You are tuned to Talk Erie and the Joel Natale Show on this Thursday. Talk Erie and the Joel Natale Show here. Ben Spagan is with us from the Jefferson. Before I go to more chat about the Tuesday election, I want you to talk about the next couple of weeks here for the Global Summit real quick. Because tonight you've got the superabundance.
Right.
Talk.
So it's a contrarian argument.
Yes.
In the, I think the conventional way of thinking would be the more people who occupy a finite planet, the fewer resources they would have access to. Marian Tupy, who's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, actually has gamed that out, and the research that he has actually proves contrary to that. That actually the more people, we create more resources. And so that phenomenon is what they're calling superabundance, that actually the more populated our planet becomes, the more resources that we have, the more resources we create. And ultimately, that's leading to, better and better living conditions for humanity. Now, I
And
fully...
this is a guy from Cato?
Yeah, guy from Cato.
Okay. That's a little counterintuitive too.
It's a libertarian think tank.
Yes.
And I think that's sometimes when you hear these arguments for so long, you wonder, do they hold up? And that's what he was interested in pursuing, is that can there be such a thing that we actually don't have, we in a traditional sense should not be concerned about overpopulation. Now, painting with a broad brush for all of the world, right? Because of course there are population centers that are way too dense, and those create horrible living conditions. And we look at developing nations and the impact on that. So not to disregard any of that, but essentially though, we are living in prosperous times as a species, and again, acknowledging that living conditions are very challenging and abhorrent for some, but on the whole of humanity, we're doing the best we've ever done.
Wow.
And so I think that helps give some framework to the argument of when were we the best? Well, the answer is not yet. I think that's that's what he's trying to game out. That was very similar to what we heard from Michael Strain, who's an economist with the American Enterprise Institute, that was with us on Monday. Who was talking about economic conditions and the threats of populism to them. And the fact that if you look at the trends on the whole, again, our economies continue to grow. Now, something he was pointing out that I think is significant, and I think we see the impacts of that in the election, is the hollowing out of the middle. Those at the top are getting richer, the bottom staying pretty stable, but there's a hollowing out of the middle. We can get into that in the political implications, but you asked me about future programming. We've got 4 more next week.
4 more? Okay.
Yeah, we're bringing in Major General Ed Bolton, retired. He was here last year, won the Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award. He's back to lead a panel discussion about leading and succeeding, lifting up future generations. His sister, Dr. Karen Bolton, an educator, current elected official, will be with him, as well as others. Then, of course, we're looking at the election, and we're bringing in a media panel to examine that. We've got Chris Matthews, we've got Tara Setmeyer, and we've got David Urban. And they all reflect different viewpoints. And of course, great opportunity to showcase our chair of the Global Summit, Steve Scully, host of the briefing. And then we conclude and wrap up this year's summit on Friday with Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr., familiar name and face to folks tuning into MSNBC and other stations. Prolific author. His most recent book, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For. Terrific on more than just leadership theory, but looking at it in practice in race in America and what that means. So tickets still available to all of those events. Folks can head over to our website, jeserie.org, to find out more details, including how to register.
Fantastic. All right, let's get back to Tuesday and the lead up to that. Kamala Harris, 100 and some days ago, gets the nomination. I want you to weigh in on her interfacing and her work with the media. You're a very media astute person. Again, we're not going to second guess everything, but boy, they put her in a box awfully early and for too long of a time, in my opinion.
So, what box do you think she was put in, and for how long?
She was not available. I mean, remember how big of a deal that they made with that Dana Bash interview? And that was, 2 or 3 weeks after and she never did host a press conference, to my knowledge, either. Those are the freewheeling, unscripted stuff is what I'm talking about.
Oh, sure. So I would say it's tough to immediately come out and do any sort of presser or interview at length when you've just been... Right. You've just been confirmed as the party's nominee, and now you have to put together plans. And for all of the, I need to hear more about her policy kind of arguments that I heard out there from folks, I'm a bit disappointed in people's ability to do their homework. She had on her website good explanations of the policy. Right. You could find details for all of that. And so, I think that's a little it's a little bit frustrating to me, Joel.
Yeah.
Where I do think, look, there an upending to a norm that we have grown accustomed to over the past 20 so years is accessibility to candidates and presidents. The outlier, of course, is Donald Trump. He is notoriously available to the media and will talk to them all the time.
But so was Obama. Obama was one of those guys that was on a lot. I mean, compare Obama to Bush. There was no comparison.
Well,
you know?
I think that as you know, as the wars wage on in Afghanistan and Iraq, they certainly pull Bush back from that, and I think rightfully so, because you know the temperature of the nation, it's not headed in the right direction, and you know people are concerned about that. So why expose him when you don't have to? Obama, yes, accessible, still not nearly as much as Donald Trump.
Correct.
Joe Biden, historically not accessible to media. Just, you know, he's working. Like, that's always been the argument, is that he doesn't have time for that, you know, that there's something else to be done. So I think the slow roll of Harris out of the gate, of course, is, well, what is the plan? You know, what's the platform? What are the issues that we're going to focus on? And then, you know, once she gets that moving, you know, we see that tick up, particularly, you know, in the final stages of it, with her making podcast appearances, her going on Fox News, and, you know, going quote unquote into the lion's den, and actually handling herself really well. And you know, look at the 60 Minutes interview. You know, she agrees to do the 60 Minutes interview. Trump says they won't because they're going to fact check it, and that's a breaking point for him. You know, her campaign says they agreed to do the Joe Rogan podcast, but you know, apparently the terms and conditions were not satisfactory to either party, so it doesn't happen. But she becomes increasingly open to that and looks for unconventional media outlets. Now, I think when she's going on podcasts like Call Me Daddy, she's going for a target audience for that, right? And then
Charlemagne the God, you know.
Exactly. So, and when she goes on Fox News, she's trying to prove, look, I hear you too, I can govern for you too. And so, you know, I think that improves over the time. However, though, is seeing the amount of campaigning that they're doing, and then especially the amount of Tim Walz, they were absolutely adhering to his call to action of, we'll sleep when we're dead. You know, like, let's get on the road, let's get out there, let's try to get in front of people. And clearly we see in the days leading up to the election, the decision to concentrate on Pennsylvania. You know, that seems to be the key state. They're going to focus most of their energy and resources in Pennsylvania. You know, they must feel confident about other states, or they just know that they need to get Pennsylvania, where you do see the Trump campaign hopping around at a few states there at the end. But yeah, I mean, I think that for given the amount of time she had, I think she did about as well as one could expect.
She did grow into it, didn't she?
Oh, absolutely.
And that's why I think some people are frustrated in saying, boy, if she could have gotten out there earlier, she would have had more experience and would have done well. Back after the news. So glad you tuned to Talk Erie and the Joel Natale Show, live from our Kingdom Financial Group studio here at 5th and State. Ben Spagan is with us. He's the vice president of the Jefferson Educational Society. Superabundance, 7:30 tonight at the JES on State Street. What is it? Next Thursday is the big political roundtable, the media roundtable with Steve Scully heading that up, and Chris Matthews and David Urban. People know these names, right? It is such a blessing to have the JES here with us. I got some questions that are getting texted in, and it does go to the question of the effectiveness, as you saw, of some of the surrogates. And so we talked to people like Liz Cheney was right here before she spoke. 3,500 people at the Bayfront Convention Center. Mark Cuban was on our show a couple times. Didn't Bernie come? Bernie came. Yep. A lot of Bill Clinton and so on. What's your thoughts on surrogates? And it was interesting with Cheney, with Kamala Harris, with Liz Cheney and her dad. Hello.
So it's hard to imagine how you build a coalition that includes Beyonce and Dick Cheney. So, if you seriously want to talk about, how big is your tent, that's a huge tent. Yes. And let's not forget that, while there were some and they received criticism for sitting it out up into the end and through, you had last-minute endorsements coming in from former California governor and Republican Arnold Schwarzenegger. Actor Harrison Ford put together a video message that came out late. You saw the backlash to the Madison Square Garden rally from Trump that yielded, Bad Bunny. J-Lo gets involved. You see the Puerto Rican community stepping up. So, again, this is a huge tent right now. Their effectiveness, which I think is the heart of your question, Joel, and the coming in from a listener, is this is the point I would wish to make. Is I don't think there's anything that the Harris campaign could have done differently to affect the outcome. I say that because clearly, if you're comparing 2016 to 2024, we know Donald Trump. We know who Donald Trump is. We know what he stands for. We know the character. In 2016, I think you can look at that voting block and say, look, there are people that, want to take a chance. There are people that favor a disruptor, including people that might have voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary and then flipped to vote for Trump in the general because they wanted a disruption and they didn't know, right? We now had 4 years of governing as president to observe, 4 years after that to observe. To say we don't know who that person is, I think would be irresponsible to the truth to ourselves. And so clearly voters wanted that. And again, I think we can sit here and argue, the machine of American government, if he wins the Electoral College but loses the popular vote, and we say, look, this thing's clearly not working anymore. How do you adapt it or get rid of it? But he won both, right? He won the popular vote. He won the Electoral College.
Kind of quieted that argument about the Electoral College, didn't he?
Yeah.
At least temporarily.
Temporarily, for sure. I think that, I think that that's one of the things that we have to look at that we've not re-examined for a while. I would put in the same conversation of it's time to consider updates, for how many representatives we have, given that the population has continued to grow. Now, it's slowed over years, but, we still have the same amount of congressional representation that we've had for decades. So, I think there are times that we need to reflect upon, do we have a system that actually functions at efficiency and effectiveness for all of those that it intends to serve, irrespective of what their parties are. But back to the surrogates, we saw a lot, and on both sides, right? You see Elon Musk, you see, and including on stage the night that Donald Trump comes out and essentially says that he's won. He declares victory that evening. Dana White, from MMA. Sorry, momentary lapse of memory for the sports. But you have celebrities on both sides, including all the way down to Detroit Rock City. You've got Kid Rock, supporting Donald Trump. You've got Eminem and Jack White supporting Kamala Harris. So you have a lot, but I'm not sure that there's any voice that was missing from that chorus that you say, well, only if this other person had endorsed, things would be different. Because Also, not just the endorsements and the surrogates, look at the anti-endorsements. How many former advisors, former insiders that worked with President Donald Trump said, do not vote for this person. It is irresponsible. He is a wannabe fascist. He has aspirations to be an authoritarian leader. This would be dangerous. This would be too risky. Do not do this. And yet that didn't move the needle. Or if anything, for a voter, they look at that and they say, that actually emboldens me more because I want this person.
I think your latter point is very well taken insofar as that at some point, it when it comes to Trump, and Trump just might be this singular figure, that kind of hyperbole, that kind of overwrought description just seems to bounce off of him.
It's Teflon Trump, right? I mean, nothing has stuck, and I think that we've been playing this game since 2015, and when he descends the escalator, because he is a. And I say this by standards of scandal. He is a troubled candidate, right? He's far from perfect. He's got divorces. He's had business scandals. He had scandals that arose during the 2016 election. He's now a convicted felon. And yet none of that dissuaded people from voting. I think that the honest question we have to ask ourselves as Americans, and I would hope those that voted for Trump, and we could honestly achieve this data so that we can better understand ourselves, the collective our, is did they vote for him in spite of that, or did they vote for him because of that? And to get an understanding of where we are as a people, because I think that trying to boil it down to simplicity, I think is runs the risk of being irresponsible. But I think that we're driven to try to do that in the immediate days following election. Is what happened? Why did it happen? And clearly, there is a block of voters that are representative of the majority now that are angry, frustrated, have grievances, feel as if the Democratic Party, once the party of the working class, does not listen to them, does not hear them, and talks down to them. And that, of course, bears out in some of the demographic data we're looking at, right? That those with more college education, those with college degrees, advanced degrees, they're tending toward the Democratic Party. And they speak like it. They speak like policy wonks. They speak like people that attended Ivy League schools, despite the fact that Republicans also attend Ivy League schools. And on the Harris ticket, you've got Tim Walz, the first person that's on a presidential ticket to not have an Ivy League degree since Jimmy Carter.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
But yet, the Republicans know how to speak to their audience. The Democrats totally lost that message. And so I think that there's nothing more, no one else who could have tried to carry that. Think about all the campaigning that both of the Obamas did for the Harris administration. And yet that didn't change the hearts and minds of the voters that I think had made up their mind that they know who Donald Trump is, they know what Donald Trump is, and they decided to vote for that.
All right. So this goes to really the essential question of what this election was about, because I feel like Kamala Harris could have had a 50-page policy manual, and she probably did, available on her website. Was this just essentially a binary on Trump of saying, hey, right now my rent went up 40%, my inflation is up 20%. There is a huge immigration problem at the southern border, and things were not this way in 2019 before the pandemic. If things were not this way under Trump, so I'm going to go back to Trump. I'm going back to the devil I know, as opposed to this lived experience under the Biden-Harris administration. But really the binary is about Trump, whether I could deal with his character and his outcomes,
Well, looking at the exit polls, clearly the economy ranks high, if in number one. In terms of what people are thinking about. Now, I think what's challenging about that is just the timing of economic swings, period, full stop. Because if you look at it, Joel, interest rates are down.
Yeah.
Inflation is down 2.2%, right? Unemployment 4%. So inflation's been reduced by a thing called the Inflation Reduction Act. It's added manufacturing jobs. So let's look at Erie, Erie as an example. In the past economic cycle, Erie has added some 1,800 manufacturing jobs to its economy. Yet the narrative of manufacturing is dead, we're losing manufacturing jobs, it's hard to beat that back when it's so loud, and that's, you can campaign on this vibes and feels economy. Like, I don't feel like the economy is working for me. I think part of that is there is this hollowing out of the middle class. And of course, that all takes nuance to explain, right? Like, I'm not an economist, and I can explain it in some broad terms, but I can't get specific. I've got to call my economist friends and be able to talk to them and have them make heads or tails of that for me. I think when you see the messaging, you don't have to drive far around Erie County to see the, Trump low taxes, Harris high taxes, Trump safety, Harris crime and violence, like that's boiled down on yard signs.
Sure.
And so when you see messaging that's so simplified for voters that feel frustrated, unheard, aren't tuning into conversations that take time to explain. And I'm not calling anybody stupid by any means, but just saying, like, if you're frustrated, you're tired, you're exhausted, and you hear, I will make you safer and I will lower your taxes, as opposed to, let me unpack the 50-page policy paper.
Right.
One of those things lands differently than the other.
And his last argument was, Kamala broke it, I'll fix it. And that'd be pretty powerful, right?
It's a...
As opposed to, Trump is a dictator, he's a fascist. What even is a fascist?
And so, great and fair question, which I think you asked rhetorically, and I'm not going to unpack what a fascist is, but you have an excellent point, Joel, and that's the the idea of, again, being able just to say, it's broken, I'll fix it, as opposed to, here's a strong list of all the people that say that he would cause harm, and you have Nobel Prize winning economists coming out and saying his economy is actually going to tank what we currently have. And I think that's why a lot of people are concerned. Look, we saw a bubble because we saw a market reaction on Wednesday to that. Now, that's businesses and corporations anticipating they're going to get the tax cuts, because that's what Trump is actually saying he's going to do. If you make more than $360,000, you're looking at tax cuts under a Trump administration. If you make less than $360,000, your taxes may go up, and I'm here to say there are a lot of us, myself included, that are well under that 360 threshold.
Indeed.
That would have benefited from anything from help with student loans to first-time homebuyer tax credit to not seeing taxes be raised by the federal government. So you're seeing market reactions right now, and I think that one of the things too, where going back to marketing and messaging, is that once we saw President-elect Trump go out on the campaign trail and say tariffs, I'm going to do tariffs, and the way he explained it, it was so hard for people to unpack that afterwards, because the way that he explains it is, I'm going to punish the other countries and I'm going to raise taxes on them. Not wholly inaccurate, but look, if you're passing the buck over to China, and China is importing goods to us and know that they're going to still need to import those goods to us, guess where the price raise goes? To the consumer. So we're looking at...
That G.I. Joe with a Kung Fu grip costs a little bit more with the tariff.
Exactly. And I mean, in a very real way, I'm hearing from business owners now that are saying, look, they're being coached by their advisors to buy a year's worth of product, 4 years worth of product to outlast the tariffs, because if you're getting goods from overseas and suddenly there are going to be these tariffs, well, China's not going to stop sending us stuff. They're just going to send us stuff, the same stuff that's now more expensive. And so that's passed over to the consumer. So if you're really worried about, bread and butter issues or eggs on your table, those are the kind of things you have to think about.
But they tried to make the tariffs into a national sales tax. And again, I have a bachelor's degree and been around the block. I couldn't figure out what that argument was about.
Right, and that's part of the just this is bad and this is good,
right?
And this would be good for you, and people bought into that. I mean, I in southwestern Pennsylvania, I was talking to folks, originally where I'm from, and now it looks like they're not getting raises and bonuses because the company's going to have to buy more product, and like that's now going to affect them. And these are voters that would have trended toward Trump. I didn't ask them who they voted for, but this is Trump country, in the South.
All right, let's bring this plane in for a landing. I want to lean in on some of your expertise. You mentioned at the top of the conversation about or actually maybe it was off the air, where we were talking about where the world is going internationally. My interfaces with international journalists, because we talked to the Irish and to the Canadians and to the Italians. They can't believe that we would vote for Trump again. They were like, there's a Trump has a brand over there. It's not good. Are you seeing that as well? Just in your understanding of the economic forces, let's say in Germany and other places,
Sure. So there's an absolute real concern of what this is going to mean internationally. So, we in America have lived, since post World War II as, as President Reagan would have put it, the, shining light upon the hill. Like we are the example, we're the model. We are, the most prosperous nation in the land, the best nation in the land, all of the superlatives and hyperbole you want to roll out. Now people are concerned because, well, one, what is American leadership going to look like, and how are we going to lead? And then also the fear that if America can elect somebody that's being touted as a fascist, as somebody that's a wannabe authoritarian, that somebody who his own words, I'll be dictator on, for day one, only day one. That's grave concerns, especially for countries like Germany that have seen fascism play out. And so in Germany, if you're, flying a Nazi flag, you're getting arrested and going to jail. I mean, they take that very seriously and atoning for what happened to them as a nation. Sure. Clearly, the difference is they have a parliamentary system. They have 6 different parties that are represented in a coalition. But the AfD, the Alternative for Germany party, is now part of that coalition because it's gaining ground. And so that's their far-right populist movement. Right. So countries are very concerned about this. And, we have to look for examples of where do we see populism being tamped down, and could we do the same thing? Are there lessons to be learned? Poland is an example. Donald Tusk did that in terms of, asking the people, connecting with the people and saying, look, you were sold this message by populist candidates that said they would do all of these things for you and they would listen. What have they actually done for you? And it turned out not much because they were ineffective at governing. So they were able to swing back away from that. Brazil got rid of Bolsonaro as well. So there are examples out there. But yeah, internationally, this has huge implications in terms of looking at, what happens next with these kinds of leaders that speak to populist movements. And that's not even taking into consideration now what's going to happen in Ukraine and what's going to happen in the Middle East. And so, of course, there are Democrats, saying that Harris was not vocal enough on issues for Palestinians and, that she didn't go far enough and that they weren't going to vote for her. Well, Donald Trump is quite cozy with Netanyahu. Yeah. I mean, they're supposedly, purportedly having conversations like on the side, while he's a candidate. So some of the moves that you're seeing Netanyahu make, I think, is anticipation of trying to wait it out and to have a U.S. president that is much more Israel friendly, that then is going to, essentially allow Israel to do whatever it needs to do, perhaps even send more resources and support that way, at the same time potentially walking back resources from Ukraine, which is trying to defend a democracy and trying to defend that against Russia. So significant implications.
One more again from your experience, working class folks. I mean, West Virginia, for example, is there was not going to be any doubt of who was going to win that Senate race, right? I mean, Joe Manchin was the independent. He retires, and the governor moves right in, right?
For sure.
So lived experience, because I think we are simpatico here in Erie County with many of the counties, let's say in southeastern or southwestern Pennsylvania, and certainly in West Virginia.
And I absolutely, and we'll start at southwestern Pennsylvania. It's not all that long ago that you look at not just Allegheny County, but perhaps 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the surrounding counties as well, voting toward Democrats because it's a party of the working class, it's a party of laborers, and rewind to the 60s, and you're seeing West Virginia still vote for Democrats, right? Like that's so. Again, here's what we see is that there had been an abandonment of people on behalf of the Democratic Party. Now the same could be cast for the Republican Party as well, but the Republican Party clearly saw a candidate that could energize that voter bloc and saying that I do hear you, I hear your frustrations, I'm going to campaign to that and toward that that they're able to pick up those votes. I mean, driving through my home county, there are signs that would connect Biden to communism, and,
Right.
and they're big signs, that's something. So I think when people feel like they're unheard, and of course there's a lot to unpack, from the impacts of automation to globalization to the fact that we weren't really ready to transition workers. We didn't have a plan. My dad was in his mid-50s when he found out he didn't have a job because his key didn't work to the lock at the coal mine one day. So there was no phasing into new industry. There was no structural economic change for that. It was simply, you don't have a job now. And when you do that, and that impacts, not just one generation, but two generations, that starts to really cement something that's been fomenting for decades, which is, I'm frustrated. Joel, we were talking off air, and I won't use the exact quote from it, but I can't help but think of the movie Network. I'm mad as heck, and I'm not going to take it anymore.
Yeah.
And more people say that, more people say that, more people say that. And clearly that's a message that the Republican campaigns got out in terms of, we're going to try to improve things. We hear you. We're with you. We're not with these large metropolitan regions of these fancy people.
And the reality of rents going up sky high, and they talk about the eggs or whatever, but seriously, it's significant. So
yeah, and we just had Charles Marone
like
here.
60 seconds, yeah.
60 seconds. So we just had Charles Marone here, who's the president and founder of Strong Towns, who's talking about a
Yes,
housing
of
crisis,
course,
right? And
yeah.
and it turns out, in Erie, we have a housing crisis too. It's expensive here, and
Yeah.
so the problem is that economic change takes time. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next week. You need to put policies in place that are going to take time to actually happen to all of the people. And unfortunately, right now we're seeing, look, it all happened. The Inflation Reduction Act, save for what it is, the word Bidenomics, it looks like it actually worked. Now, the big question is, will Trump undo all of that? Will he build on that? I hope it's the latter, because the economy is trending in a great direction right now. It would be terrible to see it upended with tariffs that are going to hurt the middle class. It's going to be terrible to see taxes on the middle class while the rich keep getting richer and the rest of us keep wondering why eggs cost so much.
Right. Leave it there.
We'll leave
Ben
it there.
Spagan. Good luck on the rest of Global Summit, and appreciate you taking the time with your expertise here, sir.
Thanks, Joel. Always a pleasure.
It is 4:57. News is next.